Dean Martin walked out of his mother's bedroom and closed the door behind him. His hands were shaking. His brother Bill was standing in the hallway, along with their sister and several cousins. They'd been waiting outside for 20 minutes, listening to the murmur of Italian voices through the door, waiting for their turn to say goodbye. Bill took one look at Dean's face and felt his stomach drop. "Dean, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Dean didn't answer. He walked past all of them, down the stairs, out the front door, and stood in the November cold, without a coat. Bill followed him outside and found Dean leaning against the porch railing, staring at nothing. His eyes were red, but he wasn't crying. He was somewhere else entirely. "What did Mama say to you?" Dean lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. "She told me the truth." "What truth?" Dean looked at his brother. The cigarette smoke curled between them in the freezing air. After a long silence, he said, "I can't tell you. I promised her I'd never tell anyone." That promise would haunt Dean Martin for the rest of his life. And the secret Angela Crosetti whispered to her son on November 6th, 1966, would explain everything. Why Dean always felt like he didn't quite belong in his own family. Why he built a wall of cool around himself that nobody could penetrate. Why he drank alone in his dressing room while everyone else celebrated. And why, years later, when a cousin discovered a letter hidden in Angela's belongings, the Martin family would finally understand the man they thought they knew. This is the story of a deathbed confession that changed everything. This is the story of what Angela told Dean. And this is the story of the secret that made Dean Martin who he was. To understand what happened in that bedroom in Steubenville, Ohio, you need to understand who Angela Crosetti was. She was a force of nature, wrapped in a 5'2" Italian frame. Born Angela Barra in 1,897 inches, Fernwood, Ohio. She was the daughter of Italian immigrants who'd come to America seeking opportunity and found backbreaking work in the steel mills instead. Angela was beautiful. Dark hair, dark eyes, a sharp tongue, and a sharper mind. She married Gaetano Crocetti in 1914 when she was 17 years old. Gaetano, who would later Americanize his name to Guy, was a barber. He was handsome, charming, and completely devoted to her. By all accounts, it was a love match. But there was something about Angela that people noticed. She was distant. Even with her own children, there was a reserve, a holding back. She loved them, provided for them, kept them fed and clothed and safe, but there was always a wall. Dean felt it more than his siblings. He would later say that he spent his entire childhood trying to make his mother smile, really smile, and only succeeding occasionally. Dean was born Dino Paul Crosetti on June 7, 1917, in Steubenville, Ohio. He was the younger of two sons. His brother Bill was 4 years older. The boys grew up in a tough neighborhood where Italian immigrants clustered together for safety and solidarity. Guy's barbershop was on the ground floor of their building. The family lived upstairs. Steubenville in the 1,920 and 30 seconds was a rough town. The steel mills ran day and night. The Ohio River carried barges loaded with coal and ore, and organized crime ran everything that mattered. Gambling, bootlegging, numbers running, it was all there, and everyone knew it. Dean grew up in this world. He worked in the barber shop. He ran errands for the neighborhood tough guys. He learned early that you kept your mouth shut, minded your business, and never asked questions. These lessons would serve him well in Las Vegas decades later. But there was always something about Dean that set him apart. He didn't look like the rest of the family. Bill took after Guy, dark and stocky and solid. Dean was taller, leaner, with lighter eyes and sharper features. People commented on it occasionally, but nobody thought much of it. Families have variations. What people didn't see was how Angela looked at Dean sometimes, like she was seeing someone else, like she was remembering something painful, and how Dean would catch her looking and feel something twist in his chest. Something he couldn't name, but that made him feel alone even in a crowded room. Dean left Steubenville in his early 20s. He became a singer, changed his name from Dino Crossetti to Dean Martin, and never looked back. He became a star. He became a legend. He became the king of cool. But he never forgot that feeling of being on the outside looking in. By 1966, Dean Martin was at the peak of his career. The Dean Martin Show was dominating television ratings. His partnership with Jerry Lewis, though long ended, had made him a household name. He was part of the Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. He had more money than he could spend and more fame than he'd ever wanted. But success hadn't healed the wound he didn't know he had. Friends noticed that Dean kept everyone at arm's length. Even Frank, his closest friend, said that Dean never really let you all the way in. There was always a part of him that was somewhere else, unreachable. On November 4th, 1966, Dean was in Los Angeles when the phone call came. His mother had suffered a massive stroke. She was in the hospital in Steubenville. The doctors said it was serious. Dean needed to come home. Dean caught the first flight out. During the 5-hour journey, he sat in first class, drinking scotch and staring out the window. He hadn't been back to Steubenville in months. His relationship with his mother had always been complicated. He loved her. He knew she loved him. But there was always that distance, that inexplicable gap he could never close. He arrived at Steubenville City Hospital at 7 o'clock in the evening. The family was already there. Bill, their sister, cousins, aunts, uncles. The waiting room was full of Crossettis and Barras, all speaking in rapid Italian, all worried. Dean's father, Guy, was sitting alone in a corner. He was 73 years old, a small man made smaller by grief. When he saw Dean, he stood up and embraced him. "Your mom has been asking for you," he said quietly. The doctors were blunt. Angela had suffered a major ischemic stroke. She was stable for now, but her condition was deteriorating. She might have hours, might have days. There was no way to know. Dean sat with his mother that first night. She was unconscious. Her breathing labored. He held her hand and talked to her in Italian, the language of his childhood. He told her about his kids, about his work, about Los Angeles. He told her he loved her. At 3 in the morning, her eyes opened. She looked at Dean and squeezed his hand. "Dino," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but clear. "I'm here, Mama." She closed her eyes again and drifted back to sleep. Dean stayed until dawn, then went to the hotel to shower and change. November 6th, 1966. Dean returned to the hospital around noon. The doctors said Angela was more alert today. She'd been asking for him. The family was gathered in the waiting room again. Dean went to his mother's room alone. She was awake, propped up on pillows. She looked small in the hospital bed, fragile in a way he'd never seen her before. He pulled a chair close and took her hand. "How are you feeling, Mama?" Angela looked at him for a long moment. Her dark eyes were clear, focused. "Dino, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Dean felt his chest tighten. "What is it?" She switched to Italian. What came next needed to be said, in the language of secrets, of confessions, of truths too heavy for English. She looked at the door. "Make sure it's closed. And tell everyone to leave. Just you and me." Dean felt a chill run down his spine. He got up, opened the door, and spoke to the family waiting outside. "Mama wants to talk to me alone for a few minutes." Bill started to protest, but Dean's expression stopped him. The family moved down the hallway, out of earshot. Dean closed the door. He returned to the chair beside his mother's bed. His hands were shaking slightly. "What is it, Mama? What do you need to tell me?" Angela took a breath. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been in days. The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them in for decades and couldn't contain them anymore. "Dino, you are my son. You are my blood. But Guy is not your father." The room went silent. Dean stared at his mother. He couldn't process what he'd just heard. What? Angela's eyes filled with tears. Before I married Guy, I was in love with someone else. His name was Antonio Basso. He was from a good family in Pittsburgh. We met at a dance. We were going to be married. She paused, gathering strength. But Antonio's family didn't approve of me. My family was too poor, too rough. They wanted him to marry someone from their circle. We kept seeing each other in secret, and I got pregnant. Dean felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. You were pregnant with me? Yes. Angela's voice was barely a whisper. When I told Antonio, he panicked. He said we had to wait, that he needed time to convince his family. But I knew the truth. He was going to leave me. I was 19 years old, pregnant and unmarried. In those days, Dino, that meant ruin. It meant shame for my entire family. What did you do? Guy Crosetti was a customer at my father's restaurant. He was kind to me. When he asked me to marry him, I said yes. We got married quickly, and I told him I was pregnant. He believed the baby was premature when you were born. Or maybe he knew the truth and loved me enough to pretend he didn't. I never asked. Dean's mind was racing. All his life, he'd felt like he didn't quite fit. Now he knew why. Does Papa know? Does Guy know? Angela closed her eyes. I think he knows. He never said anything, but I think he always knew. He loved you anyway, Dino. He raised you as his own. You are his son in every way that matters. And Antonio? My real father? What happened to him? He married someone else 6 months after I married Guy. He had a good life. He became a doctor in Pittsburgh. He died in 1952. He never knew about you. Dean stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at Steubenville, the town where he'd grown up, and felt like he was seeing it for the first time. Everything he thought he knew about himself was a lie. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm dying, Dino, and I can't carry this secret anymore. You deserve to know the truth. You always felt different because you are different. Your blood is different. But that doesn't change who you are. You became Dean Martin on your own, not because of Guy, not because of Antonio, but because of you. Dean turned to face his mother. His eyes were wet. Does anyone else know? No one. Not Bill, not your sister, not anyone. This is between you and me. Angela gripped his hand with surprising strength. Promise me, Dino. Promise me you'll never tell anyone. Let Guy die thinking you're his son. He loves you. Don't take that away from him. Dean looked at his mother, this woman who'd kept this secret for nearly 50 years, and he saw her clearly for the first time. She wasn't distant. She was haunted. Every time she looked at him, she saw Antonio. She saw her first love. She saw the choice she'd made and the life she'd left behind. I promise, Mama, I won't tell anyone. They talked for another 10 minutes. Angela told him details about Antonio, where he'd lived, what he'd looked like, that he'd had the same shaped eyes as Dean, the same way of smiling. She told him she'd loved him, but that she'd loved Guy too, in a different way, that Guy had been a good husband and a good father. When Dean finally emerged from the room, Bill was waiting in the hallway. The look on Dean's face stopped him cold. Dean, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Dean walked past his brother without answering. He went outside and stood in the cold, trying to process what he'd just learned. His entire life had been rewritten in 20 minutes. Bill followed him out. What did Mama say to you? Dean lit a cigarette with shaking hands. She told me the truth. What truth? Dean looked at his brother. Bill was Guy's son completely, genetically, undeniably. But Dean was half a stranger. I can't tell you. I promised her I'd never tell anyone. Angela Crosetti died 4 days later, on November 10th, 1966. She was 69 years old. The funeral was held at St. Anthony's Catholic Church in Steubenville. Dean stood beside Guy at the graveside, looking at the man who'd raised him as his own, and felt a complicated mix of gratitude and grief. Guy never asked what Angela had told Dean in that hospital room. If he suspected the truth, he kept it to himself. He lived 9 more years, dying in 1975, taking whatever he knew or suspected to his grave. But Angela's confession changed Dean Martin in ways both subtle and profound. Friends noticed it immediately. Frank Sinatra said Dean became even more guarded after his mother died. He drank more. He kept people at an even greater distance. The wall of cool became a fortress. Dean never told anyone what his mother had revealed. Not his wives, not his children, not Frank. He kept his promise. But the secret ate at him. He began to wonder about Antonio Basso. He had a private investigator track down information about the man, but he never made contact with Antonio's surviving family. What would he say? "Hi, I'm the son your father never knew about?" The knowledge that he was biologically half someone else explained so much. Why he'd always felt like an outsider in his own family. Why Angela had been distant with him in a way she wasn't with Bill. Why he'd felt compelled to leave Steubenville and reinvent himself completely. He hadn't just been escaping a small town. He'd been escaping an identity that never quite fit. Years passed. Dean's career continued. He became even more legendary. But those who knew him well saw the change. His daughter Diana would later say that her father carried a sadness that he never explained. "Something happened when Grandma Angela died," she said. Dad was never quite the same after that. In 1995, Dean Martin died on Christmas Day. He took his mother's secret to his grave, keeping his promise to the end. But the truth has a way of surfacing. In 2003, 8 years after Dean's death, a distant cousin was going through family belongings. She'd inherited a box of Angela's things that had been in storage for decades. Among old photographs and religious medals, she found a letter. It was dated September 1917, 3 months after Dean was born. It was written in Italian, and it was from Angela to her sister, who had died young. In the letter, Angela confessed everything. The affair with Antonio Basso, the pregnancy, the hasty marriage to Guy. She wrote about her guilt, her shame, and her fear that Dino would somehow sense the truth and hate her for it. She wrote, "When I look at my baby, I see Antonio's eyes looking back at me. Guy is a good man, but he is not Dino's father. I pray every day that no one ever discovers the truth. I pray that Guy never asks questions I cannot answer. I pray that Dino never feels the weight of this secret I carry." The cousin brought the letter to Bill Martin's widow. The family debated what to do with it. Eventually, they decided to keep it private. Dean had kept his promise to his mother. They would respect his choice and hers. But the letter explained everything. Why Angela had told Dean the truth on her deathbed. Why Dean had looked like he'd seen a ghost when he emerged from that hospital room. Why he'd kept the secret for nearly 30 years until his own death. The revelation recontextualized Dean Martin's entire life. His need for control, his emotional distance, his creation of the cool, unflappable persona. He'd built Dean Martin from scratch because, in a very real sense, Dino Crocetti had never fully existed. He'd been a boy who didn't quite fit, who carried someone else's blood, who'd been raised by a man who loved him but wasn't his biological father. And now the world understands why Dean Martin could never fully let anyone in. Because the person closest to him, his own mother, had kept him at arm's length his entire childhood. Not out of lack of love, but because loving him hurt too much. Because every time she looked at him, she saw the choice she'd made and the man she'd left behind. There's a photograph from the day of Angela's funeral. Dean is standing beside Guy, both men in dark suits, both looking at the ground. If you know the truth, you can see it in that photograph. The biological distance, the emotional complexity, the love that existed despite the secrets. Guy Crocetti raised Dean Martin as his own son. He taught him to shave in that Steubenville barbershop. He encouraged his singing. He was proud of his success, and whether he knew the truth or not, He never treated Dean as anything other than his boy. That's the real story. Not the DNA, not the biology, but the choice that Guy made to love a child, regardless of genetics. And the choice Angela made to tell Dean the truth, even though it meant reopening wounds that had taken decades to scar over. Dean Martin spent 40 years keeping his mother's secret. He never sought out Antonio Basso's family. He never tried to claim a different heritage. He remained Dean Martin, son of Guy and Angela Crosetti, even knowing the truth was more complicated. Because in the end, family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who raise you, who love you, who claim you as their own even when they know you might not be. Guy Crosetti did that for Dean Martin, and Dean honored that by keeping his promise to Angela until the day he died. The next time you see Dean Martin on screen, singing effortlessly, making it all look so easy, remember this. Behind that cool exterior was a man who knew what it felt like to not quite belong, who understood secrets and silence, who'd been told on his mother's deathbed that everything he thought he knew about himself was incomplete. And yet he kept singing. He kept performing. He kept being Dean Martin, because whoever his biological father was, he'd chosen to be Guy Crosetti's son. He'd chosen to honor the man who raised him, and he'd chosen to keep a promise to a dying woman, even when that promise meant carrying a burden that changed everything. That's the truth, Angela told Dean in that hospital room in Steubenville. That's the secret that made him look like he'd seen a ghost. And that's why Dean Martin, the king of cool, built walls that nobody could penetrate. Because sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who hurt us just by existing. And sometimes the greatest act of love is keeping a secret, even when it costs you everything.